The heat in El Paso was a physical presence, a weight that settled on the shoulders and stole the breath. It shimmered in waves above the dusty street, distorting the simple adobe storefronts into wavering apparitions. Silas Reeve felt the sun bake the back of his neck as he waited in the slow-moving line at the First Territorial Bank. He was here for supplies, a rare trip into a town he had long since learned to despise. The air inside was only marginally cooler, thick with the scent of old paper-metal coin and the cloying sweetness of a Teller's Bay rum tonic. Silas shifted his weight, his knees aching with the familiar protest of a man nearing 60 who had spent a lifetime on horseback. He was a ghost here, a relic from a past the town was eager to forget. His face a roadmap of harsh sun and harder memories, was framed by graying hair and a beard that had more salt than pepper. He kept his gaze low, his worn hat pulled down to shadow eyes that had seen too much to find any novelty in the mundane transactions of a weekday morning. The sudden crash of the front doors swinging inward broke the drowsy calm. 4 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, stormed into the bank. 2 carried shotguns, their barrels sweeping across the room with practiced menace. The other 2 brandished Colt revolvers, their movements sharp and economical. "Nobody move," the leader shouted, his voice a gravelly bark that commanded instant obedience. The pleasant murmur of commerce died, replaced by a collective gasp and the terrified whimpering of a woman near the back. Silas did not move. He did not reach for the holstered pistol hidden beneath his coat. Those days were over. He was a rancher now, a man minding his own business, a spectator to the world's endless cycle of violence. He simply became part of the scenery, another dusty old man, frozen by fear. His body slumping slightly to appear less threatening, less capable. The robbers were efficient. One herded the customers and staff against the far wall, while the other 3 vaulted the counter. Sacks were produced, filled with the clatter of coin and the soft rustle of paper currency. The leader directed the operation with curt hand signals, his eyes cold and dark above the bandana, missing nothing. He was a professional. It was almost over. The men were backing toward the door, their sacks heavy with stolen wealth. As the leader passed near Silas, his boot caught on a loose floorboard. He stumbled, cursing under his breath. A small object dislodged from his vest pocket by the jolt fell to the floor with a muted metallic thud. It spun on the dusty planks, a glint of polished silver in the dim light. The robber glanced at it, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then decided against retrieving it. Their escape was more important. With a final menacing gesture of his revolver, he and his men were gone, vanishing back into the blinding sunlight, their hoofbeats a fading drum roll against the sudden deafening silence they left behind. For a long moment, no one moved. The spell of fear held them captive. Then slowly, the room came back to life. A woman began to sob. The bank manager, a portly man with a sweat-sheened face, shakily reached for the telephone. Silas ignored in the ensuing chaos, bent down. His knees cracked in protest as he picked up the object from the floor. It was a silver pocket watch, its surface warm from the robber's body. The case was smooth, save for a small familiar dent near the hinge. His thumb, acting on a memory buried for a decade, traced the imperfection. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. With a hand that trembled for the first time in years, he pressed the release. The watch sprang open. The porcelain face was cracked and the hands frozen at 3:10. But it was the inside of the cover that stole the air from his lungs, leaving a hollow, aching void in his chest. An inscription, etched in a fine, elegant script, shimmered up at him. "To Thomas, my shining star, Father." The world dissolved into a maelstrom of memory. He was standing in a sun-drenched meadow behind his old ranch, the one he'd sold after everything fell apart. Thomas, his son, was turning 10. The boy's face was alight with a joy so pure it was almost painful to remember. Silas was pressing this very watch into his small hand. "A man needs a good timepiece, son," he'd said, his voice thick with a love he rarely expressed. To mark the good hours, the bank, the robbery, the terrified faces around him, it all faded. He was adrift in the sea of his grief, a wound he thought had scabbed over, torn raw and bleeding once more. The official report had been brief, brutal in its simplicity. A random stagecoach robbery on the road to Santa Fe. Several passengers killed, including one Thomas Reeve, aged 10. The news had reached him on the same day he'd buried his wife Sarah, taken by a sudden, vicious fever. The dual blow had shattered him, breaking not just his spirit, but the very foundation of his world. Now this watch, his last gift to his son, had reappeared in the hand of a bank robber. It wasn't random. The word echoed in the silent chambers of his soul. It was never random. The man who had held this watch was connected to his son's death. After 10 years of empty, directionless existence, a purpose cold and sharp as a shard of ice pierced through the fog of his sorrow. He closed the watch, the soft click of the lid, sealing a new and terrible vow. He would find the man who dropped it. And he would unravel the truth of that day, no matter where it led, no matter the cost. Minding his own business was over. The ranch was not a home. It was a hermitage, a place of self-imposed exile, where Silas could let his ghosts roam free. The small adobe house stood beneath a solitary gnarled cottonwood, its walls the color of dried blood under the relentless Texas sun. Inside, the air was still and heavy with the dust of years. A single table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot were the only furnishings. On the wall beside a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a boy with a gap-toothed grin hung his old U.S. Marshal's badge, split cleanly in 2. It was a relic from another life, a testament to a man who no longer existed. For a decade, Silas had lived in a state of suspended animation, his days marked by the rising and falling of the sun and the simple, repetitive chores of maintaining a few horses. He had walled himself off from the world, from memory, from feeling. But the silver watch now resting on the rough-hewn table had breached those walls. It was a key unlocking a past that he had tried so desperately to bury. He picked it up, its weight a solid, undeniable presence in his hand. The metal was cool now, but it seemed to burn his skin. He opened it again, staring at the inscription. "My shining star." A tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He had not cried in 10 years. Not when he'd lowered Sarah into the hard, unforgiving earth. Not when the circuit rider brought the news of Thomas. The grief had been too vast, too absolute for tears. It had been a void, a hollowness that consumed everything. Now the void was filling with something else, a cold, clarifying rage. Flashbacks, once held at bay by a constant low-grade haze of whiskey and exhaustion, now came unbidden. He saw Sarah, her face flushed with fever, but her eyes still full of love, gripping his hand. "Promise me you'll look after our boy Silas," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "He needs his father." Silas had promised. 2 days later, a dusty rider had delivered the telegram. Thomas was gone. He had broken his promise before it was even a day old. He saw Thomas, a whirlwind of energy, chasing lizards in the yard, his laughter echoing in the still air. He remembered the boy's endless questions about his work as a marshal. "Are you scared, Pa? Do the bad men ever win?" Silas had always answered with a confidence he didn't feel. "The law always wins in the end, son." What a lie that had turned out to be. The stagecoach robbery had been dismissed as the work of nameless bandits. A tragic but common occurrence on the frontier. Silas, shattered by the loss of his entire world in the space of a week, had accepted it. He'd resigned his commission, broken his badge, and retreated into himself. He hadn't had the strength to investigate, to question. He had simply endured. Now, holding the watch, he knew he had been a fool. The men who had killed his son were not random marauders. They were part of an organization, one still active, still bold enough to rob the first territorial bank in broad daylight. His investigation began not with a badge and authority, but with the quiet, patient methods of a man who knew how to listen. He spent days in the saloons and livery stables of El Paso, nursing a single whiskey for hours, his ears open to the low murmur of gossip and speculation. He learned that the robbery was rumored to be the work of men tied to Benjamin Clay, a name that was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. Clay was a magnate, a man of immense wealth and political ambition, who was buying up land and influence all across the territory. His name was on everything from new railways to political campaigns. He was seen as a pillar of progress, a man building a future for Texas. Silas knew better. Years ago, after he'd resigned a broken man, desperate for any work that would keep him from starving, he had briefly taken a job guarding Clay's wagon trains. No questions asked, the foreman had said. Just make sure the cargo gets through. Silas, his moral compass shattered, had agreed. But one night, a canvas flap had come loose, and he'd seen the cargo. Not supplies, not cattle, but people. Women and girls, their faces pale with terror in the moonlight. He had quit the next morning, taking his blood money and disappearing, adding another layer of shame to the guilt that already consumed him. The connection was there. The robbers worked for Clay. The watch linked them to his son. The past was no longer a closed book. It was an open wound, and Benjamin Clay was the source of the infection. His inquiries, quiet as they were, did not go unnoticed. He found his way to a small, cluttered office above a print shop, the home of the El Paso Sentinel. Its editor and sole reporter was a man named Thomas Miller, an idealistic transplant from Chicago with an intensity that burned in his eyes. "You've been asking about Benjamin Clay Miller," said, skipping the pleasantries. He was a young man, perhaps 30, but his face was lined with a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "I have reason to believe his men were involved in the recent bank robbery," Silas stated, his voice a low gravel. Miller leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What reason?" Silas placed the silver watch on the desk between them. He explained its significance, the words coming out rough and uneven, like stones pulled from long undisturbed ground. Miller listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to a deep resonant empathy. When Silas finished, the reporter was silent for a long moment. "I've been investigating Clay for months," he finally said, his voice low and urgent. "Human trafficking. He's running a massive operation abducting women from border towns, selling them to mines brothels and wealthy private buyers. The money is funding his run for governor." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture more monstrous than Silas had imagined. "My investigation led me to a personal tragedy." Miller continued, his voice cracking slightly. "My own daughter, Sarah. She came out here to join me, took a teaching position in a small town called Diablo Springs. She went missing 3 months ago. I believe Clay's men took her." The name Sarah, like his wife, was another blow from the past. "I have evidence," Miller said, his urgency growing. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his desk drawer. Names, dates, shipping manifests disguised as cattle sales. "I've traced some of the women to an old silver mine near Diablo Springs. They call it the Serpent Mine. I think that's where they're holding my Sarah." Silas looked at the notebook, then at the desperate hope in the young journalist's eyes. This was no longer just about his own quest for vengeance. "We can help each other," Miller said. "With your skills and my information, we can expose Clay and get my daughter back." Silas felt a stirring of the man. He used to be the marshal who stood for the law. "What's your plan?" "I'm meeting an informant tonight who can confirm the mine's location and security. After that, we go get her." "It's too dangerous to meet in the open," Silas warned, his old instincts flaring. "Clay's men are everywhere." "I have to take the risk," Miller insisted. "This man's wife was also taken. He's our best chance." The meeting was set for a dusty crossroads south of town, a place of desolate beauty where the desert stretched to a horizon painted in the fiery hues of sunset. Silas arrived first, concealing himself in a cluster of rocks overlooking the junction. He watched as Miller rode up a lone figure against the vast emptiness. Minutes later, another rider approached. But it wasn't an informant. It was a tall, lean man in a long duster whose silhouette was chillingly familiar. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the predatory grace of Jude Warner Clay's chief enforcer, and a man Silas had known from his martial days, a sadist who had been dismissed for his excessive brutality. It was an ambush. Silas drew his Colt, but he was too far away. Before he could get a clear shot, Warner raised his own pistol and fired. The sound was flat and ugly in the evening stillness. Thomas Miller cried out and crumpled from his saddle, falling to the dust. Warner dismounted, approaching the fallen journalist with a cold, unhurried gait. Silas broke cover, running and firing his bullets, kicking up dust around Warner's feet, forcing the enforcer to dive behind his horse. The element of surprise was lost. Warner returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, pinning Silas down. Under the cover of Warner's fire, Silas scrambled to Miller's side. The journalist was fading fast, a dark stain spreading across his chest. His eyes found Silas's, filled with a desperate final plea. The notebook. Miller rasped, pushing the small leather book from his jacket into Silas's hand. It's all in there. Everything. His grip tightened on Silas's arm. My daughter, Sarah, serpent mine. Promise me. You'll save her. I promise, Silas said the words, a solemn oath, sworn over a dying man. Miller's eyes fluttered, a final ragged breath escaping his lips. And then he was gone. Warner's voice cut through the twilight. Reeve, I know it's you. Give it up, Clay. Just wants the book. Silas didn't answer. He grabbed the reins of Miller's horse, mounted his own, and spurred the animals away from the crossroads, riding hard into the deepening shadows of the desert. Behind him, Jude Warner's curses faded into the vast, indifferent silence. He was a target now, a man with a promise to keep and a notebook that could burn Benjamin Clay's empire to the ground. The quest for his son's killer had just become a race to save another man's daughter. Diablo Springs was a town that had sold its soul. Nestled in the shadow of the mountains, it was a festering sore of played-out silver mines and establishments that catered to the desperate and the depraved. This was Benjamin Clay's territory, a place where his word was law and the official sheriff was little more than a well-paid puppet. Silas rode in under the oppressive glare of the noon sun. He had Miller's notebook tucked safely inside his shirt, its contents a weight against his chest. His first stop was the Broken Spur Saloon. According to a notation in Miller's journal, the owner, a man named Mac Johnson, had been a source, a man with a conscience buried under years of compromise. The saloon's interior was a haven of shadow, and the smell of stale beer. Behind the bar, a heavy-set man with mutton-chop whiskers watched Silas approach with weary eyes. Whiskey Silas set his voice a low rasp. And information. He placed a silver dollar on the scarred wood of the bar. The barman, Johnson, didn't touch the coin. His hand drifted below the counter. Information costs more than $1, friend, and it can cost a man his life in this town. Thomas Miller sent me, Silas said flatly. Johnson's composure cracked. Grief and fear warred in his eyes. Miller, I warned him. I told him Clay would. Clay did, Silas finished. Jude Warner shot him down 2 nights ago. He gave me this before he died. He tapped his chest where the notebook lay hidden. He asked me to find his daughter. Sarah, Johnson swore under his breath and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one to Silas. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. Neither, Silas replied, downing the whiskey in one go. Just a man with a debt to pay. In the relative privacy of a back room, Johnson confirmed what Miller had suspected. Sarah was being held at the Serpent Mine, a played-out shaft Clay used as a holding pen. "He's planning a shipment tomorrow night," Johnson whispered, his gaze darting toward the door. A dozen girls, including Sarah, headed for the border. After that, they're gone for good. "How's the mine guarded?" "Too well for one man," Johnson said. "But there might be someone who can help. A Mexican fellow, Miguel Vasquez, works at the livery. Clay's men took his wife Isabella a year ago. He's been looking for a way in ever since." Miguel Vasquez was a man hollowed out by grief, his face a mask of quiet desperation. When Silas found him shoeing a horse in the dim light of the livery stable, he saw a reflection of his own past self. He explained his purpose, and Miguel listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on Silas's face. When Silas finished, Miguel simply nodded. He led Silas to his small room at the back of the stable and produced 2 well-oiled rifles and boxes of ammunition from a hidden compartment beneath his cot. They used the old ventilation shaft on the western slope to bring in supplies. Miguel said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It is less guarded. It leads to the lower levels where they keep the women. You realize this is likely a one-way trip," Silas warned. "For a year I have prayed for this chance," Miguel replied, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "To save my Isabella or to die as a man trying. Either way, my prayers are answered." They approached the Serpent Mine under the cover of a moonless night, moving like shadows through the scrub brush. The main entrance was brightly lit by lanterns guarded by 4 men. Just as Miguel had said, the ventilation shaft was hidden and watched by only a single bored-looking guard. The man never saw Silas approach from the darkness. A single swift blow was all it took. The shaft descended into the suffocating blackness of the earth. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of dust and despair. They moved through a labyrinth of tunnels until a faint sound reached them, the soft, heartbreaking sound of weeping. They found them in a large cavern locked in crude iron cages like animals. A dozen women, their faces etched with fear and hopelessness. A hushed whisper in Spanish guided them. "La Americana." They keep her separate. Silas left Miguel to work on the cage locks, following a side tunnel to a reinforced wooden door. He didn't bother with the padlock. A single well-placed shot from his Colt blew it apart. Inside, a young woman, thin and dressed in rags, scrambled to the back of the small cell. Her eyes, however, blazed with a fierce, defiant light. In her hand, she clutched a sharpened piece of metal. "Sarah Miller's," Silas asked, holstering his weapon to show he meant no harm. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Your father sent me." The hope that flared in her eyes was almost immediately extinguished by suspicion. "My father? Where is he?" Silas gave her the truth gently, but without hesitation. Her face crumpled, but only for an instant. She mastered her grief with a strength that astounded him. To prove his story, he gave her the small photograph of her that Miller had carried. Tears finally welled in her eyes as she looked at the image from a happier time. "We need to go," Silas said. Gunfire erupted from the main cavern. They had been discovered. They rushed back to find chaos. Miguel had freed several women, but guards were pouring in from the main entrance, their rifles barking in the confined space. Miguel was pinned down, providing covering fire for the escaping women. "Run!" Silas shouted, shoving Sarah toward the ventilation shaft. He took cover behind a mining cart, his Colt bucking in his hand as he fired at the advancing guards. Then a new voice, cold and commanding, cut through the din. "Well, well. Silas Reeve. A ghost from the past." Jude Warner stepped into the cavern, flanked by more of his men. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Still trying to save the world, old man? I thought you'd learned your lesson." Before Silas could reply, Miguel made a desperate move, trying to give the last of the women time to escape. A rifle cracked, and Miguel was thrown back against the cavern wall, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He slid to the floor, his life's quest ending in sacrifice. Enraged, Silas laid down a volley of covering fire, forcing Warner and his men to duck. "Go!" he roared at Sarah. He backed into the tunnel after her, the last thing he saw being Miguel's still form on the dusty ground. Warner's taunting voice echoed after them. "You can't run forever, Reeve." They fled through the twisting tunnels, the sounds of pursuit close behind. They were fugitives, a broken old man, and a girl who had just lost her father, with the weight of a dead man's promise, and the full might of Benjamin Clay's empire hunting them. The desert was a harsh sanctuary. For 2 days, Silas and Sarah moved under the blistering sun and the cold, watchful eyes of the stars. They were fugitives, their faces and names already known to every man in Clay's employ. They spoke little, their shared journey forging a silent bond of respect and necessity. Sarah, he learned, possessed a resilience that matched her father's, a core of steel beneath her fear. Their destination was the only place Silas could think of that might offer refuge, the remote cabin of James Cooper. Cooper was a Texas Ranger, one of the few men Silas had ever trusted completely. Years ago, during the war, Silas had freed a young slave named James from a Confederate patrol. That boy had grown into a man of unwavering principle, dedicating his life to the law that had given him his freedom. If anyone in Texas was beyond Clay's corrupting influence, it was Cooper. They found him tracking a band of rustlers in the Davis Mountains. The reunion was one of quiet astonishment. Silas Reeve Cooper said, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "I'll be damned. I heard you'd settled down to drink yourself to death." "Almost did," Silas admitted. He introduced Sarah, and over a meager campfire that night, laid out the entire story: the Watchmiller's murder, the notebook, the nightmare at the Serpent Mine. Cooper listened, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Silas finished, the ranger took the notebook, his fingers tracing the meticulous script. "I've heard whispers about Clay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But this is an empire built on human misery." Together, the three of them pored over the notebook's contents. It was more than a list of names. It was a blueprint of Clay's criminal enterprise. It detailed a shadow government of bought judges, intimidated lawmen, and blackmailed politicians, all financed by the trafficking of human lives. And it spoke of a secret high-stakes auction, an annual event where Clay sold his most valuable acquisitions to the territory's elite. This is how he maintains his power. Sarah realized, her voice trembling with anger. It's not just money. It's leverage. He holds their secrets and their daughters. If we can get this to Judge Parker in Fort Worth, Cooper said, the federal government will have to act. Parker is a harsh man, but he's incorruptible. The plan was desperate. Cooper would take the notebook to Fort Worth. Silas and Sarah would lay low in Cooper's cabin. But Silas knew they couldn't just wait. The rage that had been simmering since El Paso was boiling over. He needed to face Clay to look the man who had orchestrated his family's destruction in the eye. Leaving Sarah with Cooper, Silas rode to Clay's sprawling ranch, a monument to greed, built on a foundation of suffering. He didn't go in shooting. He used his knowledge of Clay's operation from his time as a guard to gain access, claiming to be a former employee with valuable information. He was led not to some backroom enforcer, but to the man himself. Benjamin Clay was in his study, a room of polished mahogany and rich leather. He was handsome, silver-haired, the very picture of a civilized gentleman. He looked up from his papers, a warm, welcoming smile on his face that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Silas Reeve Clay said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? I thought you'd retired from our little enterprise." "I'm here about my son Silas," said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He placed the silver pocket watch on the polished desk. Clay's smile faltered for only a second. He picked up the watch, turning it over in his manicured hands. Ah, yes. The stagecoach on the Santa Fe Trail. A messy bit of business, but profitable. That payroll was the seed money for everything you see here. He gestured around the opulent room, the foundation of an empire. The casual, dismissive confession was more damning than any angry denial. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Why Silas whispered the single word, encompassing a decade of pain. Why Clay laughed a sound utterly devoid of warmth. Because I could. Because the world belongs to men who are willing to take what they want. You of all people should understand that. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It wasn't random, Silas. We knew that payroll was on board. Your son, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Collateral damage in the pursuit of progress. The carefully constructed dam of Silas's control finally broke. The grief and rage of 10 years erupted in a single guttural roar. He lunged across the desk, his hands reaching for Clay's throat. But Clay was prepared. He kicked his chair back, and 2 guards hidden behind a tapestry burst into the room and their guns leveled. Get him out of here, Clay ordered, calmly straightening his tie. He served his purpose. As the guards dragged him from the study, Silas's mind was terrifyingly clear. The fight was no longer for redemption or for justice in the abstract. It was for vengeance. He now had a face to put to his son's murder, and he would see Benjamin Clay in his grave if it was the last thing he ever did. The confrontation transformed the hunt. Clay, knowing Silas possessed the truth, unleashed the full force of his power. He was no longer just a criminal. He was Judge Benjamin Clay, a recent appointee to the Territorial Circuit Court. From the bench, he wielded the law like a bludgeon. Within days, wanted posters appeared in every town and trading post from El Paso to Fort Worth. They depicted Silas Reeve, the grizzled, dangerous kidnapper, and Sarah Miller, his tragic, unwilling accomplice. A massive bounty was placed on their heads, dead or alive for Silas alive, only for Sarah, a chilling testament to Clay's possessiveness. They were no longer just fugitives. They were notorious outlaws. The world shrank around them. Doors that might have been open were now bolted shut. Faces that might have offered sympathy now looked away in fear. Every rider on the horizon was a potential bounty hunter, every friendly face a potential betrayal. They were utterly alone, hunted by the very system they sought to expose. Cooper's cabin became a prison. For weeks they were trapped, subsisting on stored supplies, while the hunt raged outside. The weight of their isolation was immense. It was during these dark, desperate days that their bond solidified. Silas, haunted by the daughter he'd failed to protect, found himself becoming a surrogate father to Sarah. He taught her how to track, how to shoot with cold precision, how to read the subtle language of the wilderness. Sarah, in turn, saved him from the abyss of his own rage. She reminded him of the purpose beyond vengeance, her father's mission, the other women, the justice that was bigger than one man's loss. They studied the notebook, memorizing its contents, understanding the intricate web of corruption that Clay had woven. They were no longer just hunter and hunted. They were partners united against a common, monstrous foe. Their allies were intimidated into silence. Mac Johnson, the saloon owner, was found dead in an alley, a knife in his back. The official ruling was a robbery gone wrong. Miguel Vasquez's family in Mexico received an anonymous, generous payment, ensuring their silence. The world was being scrubbed clean of anyone who could help them. They knew they couldn't hide forever. Their final desperate plan took shape around the notebook's most explosive secret, the date and location of Clay's annual auction. It was to be held at his newly completed estate, a veritable fortress, during a lavish gala celebrating his judicial appointment. The territory's most powerful and corrupt figures would all be in one place. It was an impossible target, but it was also their only chance. It's a suicide mission. Cooper stated, his face grim. We're already dead men, Silas replied. This is just a matter of choosing how we fall. They found unexpected allies in the very people Clay had wronged. Mac Johnson's brother, a rancher named Frank, had no love for the official version of his brother's death. Marcus Pearson, an old trapper whose granddaughter had disappeared years ago after an encounter with Clay's men, had been waiting for a chance at payback. They were a small, ragged band, a grieving rancher, an old trapper, a wounded ranger, a broken ex-marshal, and a young woman armed with her father's truth against an army. Theirs was a fool's hope, but it was all they had left. The night of the auction, the heavens themselves seemed to conspire with their desperate plan. A thunderstorm born in the mountains rolled across the desert, its clouds a bruised purple against the horizon. Clay's estate was an island of defiant light in the encroaching darkness, a sprawling hacienda buzzing with the arrival of the territory's elite. Carriages lined the long drive, and music spilled from the grand ballroom, a veneer of civilization over the barbarism to come. The first part of the plan was the most dangerous. Sarah, her identity concealed by a simple servant's dress and a heavy veil, was smuggled into the estate by a sympathetic kitchen hand, a woman whose own sister had been taken by Clay's network. Her mission to get inside the auction hall, identify the key players, and create a diversion at the appointed time. Every step she took inside the lavishly decorated halls was a step through enemy territory, a single misstep away from discovery and death. Outside, hidden in the scrubland beyond the estate walls, Silas Cooper and their small band of allies waited. The wind picked up, carrying the first scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The tension was a living thing, a knot tightening in Silas's gut. He checked his Colt for the 100th time, the worn grip a familiar comfort in his hand. Inside, Sarah moved through the throngs of guests, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw men whose names she knew from her father's notebook, judges, senators, wealthy cattle barons, all laughing and drinking their faces, masks of civility. In a quiet alcove, she overheard two men discussing a prime lot from the Miller estate, a cruel joke that sent a chill down her spine. The auction was to be held in the library, a room fortified and guarded the true black heart of the glittering affair. At precisely 10 o'clock, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Sarah acted. She accidentally dropped a silver tray of glasses near the library doors. The crash was a signal, a small sound lost in the music, but clear as a gunshot to the men waiting outside. As the guards were distracted by the commotion, Silas and his men scaled the rear wall. The storm broke in earnest, the rain coming down in blinding sheets, the thunder cracking like artillery fire, masking their approach. The fight was chaotic and brutal. They were outnumbered, but they fought with the fury of desperate men. Frank Johnson and Marcus Pearson, fueled by years of repressed grief, fought like demons, their shotguns carving a path through Clay's guards. Silas moved through the chaos with a single-minded purpose. He fought his way through the gardens, through the panicked guests toward the library. He kicked the doors open to find a scene of gilded horror. A dozen terrified women were huddled on a small stage. The auctioneer had just begun the bidding. Benjamin Clay stood beside him, a triumphant smile on his face. The smile vanished when he saw Silas drenched and bloodied standing in the doorway. Reeve Clay snarled, drawing a silver-plated revolver from his coat. The room erupted in panic. The buyers, their depravity exposed, scrambled for the exits. Silas ignored them. His world had narrowed to the space between himself and the man who had destroyed his life. He and Clay fired at the same time. A searing pain tore through Silas's side, but his own shot was true. Clay cried out, staggering back, clutching his shoulder. The final confrontation took place not with guns, but with words. As Cooper and the others secured the room, Silas cornered the wounded Clay against a massive ornate desk. "This is for my son," Silas growled, pressing the barrel of his Colt against Clay's temple. Clay laughed, a wheezing, bloody sound. "Your son," he gasped, his eyes wild with pain and a strange, twisted glee. "You want to talk about sons, Marshal? Let's talk about my family. Let's talk about the farm you seized for back taxes when you were the righteous arm of the law. The farm that was all we had. You broke my father. You left my family with nothing. I was just a boy watching as you rode away, so proud of the justice you'd served." The revelation hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. He vaguely remembered the incident, a routine foreclosure, one of dozens. He'd just been following orders. "Everything I built, Clay, hissed everything I did." It started that day. "You created me, Reeve. This is your justice come home to roost." For a heartbeat, Silas faltered. The clean lines of his vengeance blurred. But then he looked past Clay and saw Sarah helping the other women, her face a mask of compassion and strength. He saw the memory of his son not as a symbol of revenge, but as the bright, shining boy he had loved. Clay saw the shift in his eyes and made a last desperate move, grabbing a letter opener from the desk and lunging. Silas reacted on pure instinct. The gunshot was deafening in the suddenly silent room. Benjamin Clay fell back against the desk, his eyes wide with surprise, and then slid to the floor. The empire of misery he had built collapsing around him. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the quiet aftermath, Silas stood over the body of his enemy, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary emptiness. The ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. In the gray light of dawn, the estate was a scene of quiet devastation. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. The last of Clay's men were rounded up, their arrogance replaced by sullen defeat. The rescued women wrapped in blankets and disbelief were being cared for by Sarah and the kitchen staff who had helped them. Their ordeal was over, but their journey back to themselves had just begun. Silas sat on the veranda steps, the rain-washed stone cold beneath him. A doctor, one of the terrified party guests, had crudely stitched the bullet wound in his side. Every breath was a fresh stab of pain, but it was a clean pain, a pain of the present, not the festering wound of the past. He watched as Sarah moved among the women, her voice calm and reassuring. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, a leader born from the ashes of her own tragedy. She came and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee. They didn't speak for a long time, simply watching the sun rise, painting the scarred landscape with tentative strokes of gold and pink. "It's over," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Silas replied. He felt hollowed out, the rage that had driven him for so long now, gone, leaving a vast, quiet space in its place. He had his vengeance, but it felt like ashes in his mouth. "He told you about his family," Sarah said, not as a question. Silas nodded. "He tried to make it my fault." "Was it? I was a lawman following orders," Silas said, the old justification sounding thin even to his own ears. "But the law isn't always the same as what's right. I see that now. I was so sure of myself back then, so certain of my own righteousness. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did help create him." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You didn't make him choose cruelty. You didn't make him trade in human lives. His choices were his own, just as yours are now." Her words were a balm, a quiet absolution he hadn't known he needed. He looked at her, this young woman who had lost so much, and saw not a reflection of the daughter he'd lost, but a vision of the future. Just after sunrise, a column of riders appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a posse of bounty hunters or more of Clay's men. It was a contingent of U.S. Marshals led by a grim-faced captain. Cooper, it turned out, had sent a courier with a copy of the notebook's most damning pages to Fort Worth days before the raid, a final brilliant contingency. The federal authorities arrived not as saviors, but as a cleanup crew ready to dismantle the remnants of Clay's vast network based on the evidence the heroes had secured. The resolution was swift and decisive. Cooper, despite his broken leg, gave a full and detailed report, earning a commendation and a promotion that would take him to a position of authority in Austin. The surviving members of their small band, Frank Johnson and Marcus Pearson, were declared heroes, their actions legitimized by the federal marshals. Sarah found her calling. She spent days interviewing the rescued women, giving voice to their stories. A telegram arrived from the Chicago Tribune, offering her a permanent position to report on the corruption her father had died to expose. She was leaving, heading east to build a new life, to fight her battles with words and truth. On the day she was set to leave, a marshal approached Silas as he was recovering at Pearson's trading post. He carried a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a new, polished silver star. "The U.S. Attorney General sends his compliments, Mr. Reeve," the marshal said. "He believes a man of your skills and experience would be a valuable asset. He's authorized me to offer you your commission back." Silas looked at the badge. It was a chance to be the man he once was, to reclaim the honor he had lost. It was everything he thought he wanted. He saw a future of purpose, of bringing order to a lawless land. But then he looked past the badge and saw the cost. He saw the bodies of Thomas Miller and Miguel Vasquez. He saw the cold, dead eyes of Benjamin Clay. He saw his own reflection, a man who had been consumed by the very darkness he fought. He closed the box and handed it back to the marshal. "Thank you," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "But that man is gone. Tell the Attorney General I'm retired." The final scene was one of profound and solitary peace. Weeks later, when his wounds had scarred over and the world had moved on, Silas rode to the small windswept cemetery where his family was buried. The two simple headstones stood side by side. Sarah Reeve, beloved wife and mother, and Thomas Reeve, beloved son. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound in the vast silence. Silas stood before the graves for a long time, the ghosts of his past no longer screaming for vengeance, but resting quiet beside him. He took the silver pocket watch from his coat. It was the alpha and omega of his journey, the object of his grief, and the catalyst for his final terrible purpose. Its job was done. He knelt down, his knees cracking, and placed the watch gently on the earth at the base of his son's headstone. The silver gleamed in the late afternoon sun, a final shining tribute. He had not reclaimed his old life, nor had he earned a simple redemption. He had simply closed a chapter, paid a debt, and in doing so had found a quiet peace that had eluded him for a decade. He stood, turned his back on the graves, and walked away. Not a lawman riding into the sunset, but just a man finally free of his past, walking toward whatever remained of his future.